Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest and baldest philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who, as you well know, has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Not sure about the baldness part, but there you go. So, in this video, I wish to talk to you about the Marxism of Ayn Rand. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute, Eugene, you're probably insane. Like, what kind of Marxism could Ayn Rand have if she is considered to be like one of the icons, one of the idols of a libertarian movement, which is like 100% opposite to Marxism? So, if you're wondering, let me speak. So basically, yeah, this is a fair point. Like, she is considered to be one of the most prominent thinkers in libertarian movement, and sadly so, I should say, because in my opinion, this creates a bad image for libertarians in culture, and I wish to talk to you about that in this particular video. And one important caveat here, again, just as is in my previous video about Einstein and Hawking, I wouldn't be talking about Ayn Rand herself, like the person, right? I would only be discussing her impact on culture, her ideas, if you like. And in fact, only one particular idea, which is, well, of course, yeah, she had many ideas, right? She had many, she had written many books, etc., but she even has this, you know, philosophy of objectivism, which I don't treat really seriously, and I don't recommend anyone to do that, because I think it's just complete rubbish. Like, you know, this philosophy of the type of existence exists, A equals A. It's kind of, it would have been cool to have that kind of philosophy, you know, in the second half of 17th century, but to promote something like that in the middle of the 20th century, you know, after Nietzsche, after logical positivists, is just ridiculous. Like, literally, it's ridiculous. So, no, I'm sorry. It's not really a philosophy. It's just some naive stuff. So anyways, she had many of these various works, but the idea that I wish to discuss here is about this, you know, Atlas Shrugged thing. It's probably the most recognized thing about Ayn Rand, this particular idea, that, you know, there are these atlases, you know, this sort of like a chosen minority of productive people, of like, you know, almost like half gods who have some sort of divine power in them, who exactly do that. They kind of produce, they're like the chosen ones, and you have this, you know, gray masses of stupid majority that tries to oppress the atlases and kind of utilize them to their own, as means to their own ends, so to speak. So this is the idea I'm going to be talking about, and in Atlas Shrugged, kind of what is being proposed, basically, in a nutshell, is that these chosen ones should kind of run away from this oppressive majority and kind of let them starve, let them die, and whatever, and just enjoy some sort of paradise on their own. This is the idea I'm going to be talking about, and of course, it also has some reminiscence to what I call repentive thinking. See one of my previous videos that is literally called repentive thinking. But I wouldn't be talking about that cultural aspect. Here I'm focusing more on socio-political, socio-economical aspects, if you like. So yeah, so why do I say that there's some Marxism in this idea and in Ayn Rand, like in general? Well, it's exactly because I think this idea has many similarities with what Marxists state. Basically, the patterns of thinking here, the patterns of cultural dynamics are so close that I would even go as far as to call Ayn Rand a Marxist among libertarians. So since I've made such a, strong statement, let us first examine Marxism itself, okay? So that would be a very long segment, after which we'll return to Ayn Rand. So the main idea of Marxism, in my opinion, is basically constructing a conflict in society to gain some political leverage out of it, okay? So, and basically everything else is supplementary. So this conflict is kind of the main idea of Marxism. And everything else is just built in such a way as to kind of lead to that conflict and reinforce it, all right? And the conflict I'm talking about is, of course, this conflict between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, where, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but there's an interesting conspiratorial touch to Marxism, because some people think that Marx was actually a spy of the British Empire, whom the British intelligence basically recruited him to spread these ideas to basically suppress any competitors to the Brits, in particular Germany, Russia, United States to a lesser degree. So that's where all these ideas of social democracy, socialism were spreading the most actively. France also, but again to sort of like a lesser degree. And it actually makes sense, in my opinion. Like if you look at earlier works of Marx, he was actually a pretty good philosopher in his Anakin stage, so to speak. Like his PhD thesis about the difference between the Epicurean and Democritus philosophies of atomism, it's really brilliant. So I highly recommend you to read that if you haven't yet. I mean, if you're interested in particle physics and things like that. Even though the text is kind of heavy, but the ideas are good, but the text is very heavy, and I think it's a sign of that Marx was already infected with this, marasmus of Hegel already at that point, and it kind of feels that way anyway. But when Marx met Engels, like I think that was more or less when he was recruited, and he started producing these stupid texts about proletariat versus bourgeoisie, etc., etc. But anyway, even without that, okay, let us continue for a little bit. So, and he was sitting at the, like a capital of the world's oppression, basically. He was sitting in London, in the capital of the world's imperialism in 19th century, and he was preaching this, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist agenda, which looks completely ridiculous. And he actually took money from Engels, who was a capitalist. So he was basically a parasite himself, whereas a bourgeois, Marx. And he actually stated once that there's one thing I know is that I'm not Marxist. So maybe it was his attempt at British humor or something, but I don't know. But it's a very interesting theory. But regardless of whether this all is true or not, let us return to the realm of ideas, to the realm of culture. So in order to reinforce this conflict, as I've said, Marxists try to draw various, kind of supportive lemmas in mathematical terms, supportive theories and ideas. And they have to invoke a bunch of various metaphysical, which basically reads imaginary, objects and relations, to justify this conflict, this narrative that they have. Like for example, they use this so-called labor theory of value, where it basically states that the more labor you put into something, the more value this something should have. Which sounds kind of reasonable, but if you think about it a little bit harder, you would see that it's just rubbish. Like, if you're producing something that nobody needs at all, you wouldn't have any value at all, again, regardless of how much effort you've spent to produce it, right? It seems kind of obvious. So in this sense, I would say that Marx himself wasn't even very well versed even in the economical theory of his own age, right? So right at that time, roughly at the 1860s, let's say, there have been emerging new theories, new economical theories, such as, for example, the marginalism, and again, the subjective theory of value, whereas Marx used this old labor theory of value. So subjective theory of value basically says that there is no value outside the act of exchange, outside the act of trade. So, like, whatever you have to propose for trade only has value for your counter agent only as much as he or she values it according to their, set of values, basically, according to their set of needs, etc., etc. So they don't care how much effort, how much labor you've put into whatever you have to propose. They only care about their own value of what you have to propose, right? So, and this seems completely reasonable, at least I hope you perceive it as reasonable, because it is reasonable. But Marx completely disregarded that, basically, and he completely disregarded the marginalist economic theory, proposed by people like, or at least promoted by people like Karl Menger, Léon Walras, and others. But anyway, so it was all happening roughly when Das Kapital was written in 1860s. And Marx completely missed that. He completely ignored that. So he cannot be considered as some sort of pinnacle of economic thought. He actually missed, the train of economic thought at that point, at least. So he was ignorant of all that, and okay. So let's return to this main thing, the conflict between proletariat and bourgeoisie. So I think both proletariat and bourgeoisie might easily be deconstructed according to more market thinking in some sense. So what Marx talks about is basically the kind of a point of view of an accountant in some endeavor, in some, limited liability company or something to that effect. So he says that, basically, there are like, again, according to labor theory of value, the workers produce stuff, okay? So there's this metaphysical concept of value, or added value, as Marxists call it, that workers produce, and then it goes to their employer, who takes, some part of it and takes it to himself or herself, and he only returns, or she, only a part of it to the workers themselves, right? So that really looks like a unjust thing, right? If you start from this labor theory of value. But that looks like that only from an accountant's perspective, right? It's only if you look at some firm, some company, where you have, the income versus, expenditures on salary and things like that. But okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for now, I think I should kind of try to provide a more market-oriented perspective. So if we have a free market, which we don't actually, still, hypothetically, if we have a free market, or at least mostly free market, then market relationships are purely voluntary, right? Nobody forces anyone to enter into some contract to buy or sell anything. Like, of course, you can be bombarded by advertisement, but if you're a sane person, you can resist that, and you can make whatever decisions you want, basically, right? And nobody even permits the anti-advertisement propaganda to persist, which we see a lot in modern world, for example. But anyway, so all the contracts, all the acts of exchange are voluntary in free market, okay? Then what follows from that is that people only buy stuff that they want, right? Because, well, if it's all voluntary, why would they buy anything that they don't want? It seems pretty obvious. So they pay only when they value whatever they receive more than the money they give away for that, right? It also seems very straightforward, very obvious. So again, this kind of reinforces the subjective theory of value. But anyway, and in this system, some person X, let's say, might say, well, okay, I want to have some money to buy stuff that I would like to buy, so maybe I should produce something that I can exchange for other people's money, right? And they do that. But in order to produce that stuff, they might need help from other people, right? So X might pay Y, another person, to help him to produce whatever he wants to sell later. So this is another, how do you call it? There's some word which I forgot. So another contract, basically, another deal, if you like. So X pays to Y for some service of helping to produce some stuff that he later would sell to someone else. And this is 100% according to free market. Like, nobody forces anyone to do anything, etc., etc. So there is no real antagonism. Like, in all these, transactions, that was the word that I forgot. In all these transactions, everything is voluntary, right? Nobody forces the buyer to buy whatever X proposes. Nobody forces Y to take money from X to devote some of his effort to help X produce whatever they're selling later. Nobody forces X to employ Y, etc., etc. So it's all market-oriented, right? It's all voluntary. But, so there's no conflict in the system, right? But somehow Marx tries to isolate this subcontract, if you like, between X and Y and say, well, wait a minute, let's try antagonizing X and Y. Like, why the hell is X getting money from the buyer, I'm sorry, whereas Y only gets money from X? Like, this is unfair, right? Etc., etc. So this is the artificial attempt at, again, creating conflict, like in a playing field, like just as I've said previously. Like, the whole point of Marxism is in creating conflict and trying to draw political resources from that conflict, right? In the very same manner, Marx could have, for example, tried to antagonize buyers versus sellers on a free market. Like for example, X sells some goods to general public, so he's the seller and they're the buyers. Or Y sells his labor to X, again for money, and he's the seller. But obviously, like, it's pretty clear that every one of us, like any human being in the society, acts as both buyer and seller on different occasions, right? So you cannot really build any consistent conflict, that would kind of form these political groups that would help you to promote whatever the agenda you're promoting. So that doesn't work, but you can, through a certain, again, optics of this an accountant type, you can isolate Y from X, and you can forget basically about the buyers of whatever X produces, and you can focus on that and create this antagonism of Y, who is proletariat, and X, who is bourgeoisie, right? So that might help you to release those, passions of envy, of greed that people might have, of, this general ressentiment approach to life, this slave mentality. So people will say, yeah, it seems wrong that X has more money than I do, So even if X gives me money for my work, I still hate him, that kind of approach. We'll talk about that a couple of minutes later, I think, at least maybe 10 minutes later. I don't know so far. So, well, okay, you might say, well, the antagonism is based on, the means of production, because obviously X has some resources, he probably has some other employees, and Y doesn't have that. He only has his labor to kind of propose for sale, right? For sale. Well, I would say that this whole concept of means of production is very, very vague, to be honest. Like, again, Y also has some means of production. Like, he produces whatever he produces with his, mind, hands, his intellect, his coordination, whatever is required for that kind of work. Like, if he's a musician, he has, his how do you call it? I don't know. His pitch, I guess. His, again, coordination, like he knows all the scales and all the harmonies. He have rehearsed it many times and whatever. So, etc., etc. So you can have different requirements for different jobs, basically, and you can call all of that means of production. Like a random Joe without these skills wouldn't be able to apply for that job, right? So there's already some sort of injustice in that certain people can be applicable, can apply to certain jobs, whereas many other people cannot. So this is also a certain, possibility for antagonizing people, but Marx probably wasn't smart enough to notice it or something, I don't know. But anyway, my point here is that the whole idea of means of production is really stupid. It's just stupid. I mean, you can abstractly say, well, okay, there are means of production. Well, yeah, so what? The question is, right? Well, maybe some more naive person might say, well, it's, by means of production, we mean factories, right? So, okay, well, in that case, what are factories? They're not there just to, oppress these Ys, these proletariat, who kind of go there, be oppressed, and go home, and then receive their salary or whatever. Factories are there only to sell stuff to somebody else, right? To the buyer. So they're only there until they serve the interests of the buyer, of the society, essentially, right? So, again, this idea of isolating only part of the market process and only like completely arbitrary part, to be honest, is just stupid. I hope you see that. But anyway, or one could say, well, wait a minute, Eugene, you're saying that the market deals are voluntary, market transactions are voluntary, but they're not. Like, a person would starve if they wouldn't work. So Y is forced to work on factories of X, and X utilizes this, again, leverage, or I guess, this advantage he has, his factory, to kind of squeeze everything out of Y, right? And just paying him the absolute bare minimum. Well, in that case, I should remind you what I've talked about in my video about copyright, where I've explicitly stated that, excuse me, but yes, you would starve, but it's not the blame of capitalism, you know, it's the blame of the world we live in, you know. There's this famous saying that if you're not socialist when you're 16, you don't have a heart, but if you're not conservative when you're 30, let's say, then you don't have a brain. So yeah, it's kind of, you know, it's this socialism it's this entitled approach, this infantile, childlike approach to life, that people should work for you just because you are, you know, just because you are so beautiful. Everyone should provide everything to you for free, like food, medication, education, and you can just sit there, you know, and receive all that for free from other people. Well, no, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. Like, it's probably the natural process of growing up when people start to understand that, yeah, world doesn't work that way, you know. But if you remain in the stage of a child where parents provide everything for you, then you have this socialistic mindset that, yeah, everyone should work for me, and I would just be lying down and be lazy, you know. But yeah, the world doesn't work that way. Like, if you demand someone to provide you food, well, they should work for that, you know. The food, again, as I've said in my copyright video, it doesn't fall from the sky. Somebody should, you know, raise cattle or plant seeds and grow them and whatever to provide food for you. Like, who are you to demand them to give it to you for free if they've worked to produce it? And the same is with everything else, basically. So the resources are scarce, which means that people should work to obtain them, which means that you should also work to exchange the product of your work to whatever you need from society, essentially. But if you're not ready to work for the society's benefit, well, yeah, I'm sorry, but you're probably just a entitled piece of shit, basically. Socialist, essentially. So, yeah. So returning to our accountant's perspective, I would say that a buyer, this other person that buys from X, he's not interested really how exactly X acquired this product, these goods that he's selling. And neither should Y be concerned what X is doing later, right? X and Y have pretty straightforward contract. Like, Y provides some services, like he turns some screws on a factory or whatever, and he shouldn't be concerned. Like they have a clear contract. Like, you turn the screws and you receive money in return. So why the hell should X be accountable for, I mean, in front of Y, for everything that comes afterwards? Like, it's just ridiculous. But of course, Y can say, well, there's this dude, Karl Marx, who said that, well, you should go and talk to accountant, and accountant would say, well, yes, our profits are above zero, so we're receiving more money from buyers than we're giving off to you guys who are turning the screws. So it's probably unfair, you know. Well, if it's unfair, don't hire there. Like, what the hell? Go do something else. Well, okay, that's a very long discussion. I feel like I'm getting super digressed here. So anyway, in the long run, like in the ultimately, X, the capitalist, he benefits both the society by selling them whatever they want to buy, and he benefits the proletariat, you know, these Ys who employ to turn the screws at his factory, because, again, if we have a free market, nobody forces Y to employ at this factory to turn the screws. So it means that Y values, again, see subjective theory of value, Y values his work less than he values the amount of money that he receives from X, right? Otherwise, Y would choose something else to do, right? But he thinks it's a fair deal to exchange that amount of work for that amount of money. So it seems absolutely fair. So what the hell? Like, it's completely just, right? So the capitalist essentially makes everyone better, and still Marxists insist that it's not the case, right? They still insist that there's some metaphysical value created by Y, who didn't do shit, you know, he didn't invest in the creation of this factory, in, you know, electricity for it, like blah blah blah. Like there's like hundreds of you know, things that you should do to organize it all, but still Marxists feel entitled for all that just because they've went there to turn the screws, because they don't know anything else to do, because they cannot do anything else, because they're, well, okay, anyway. Yeah, so Marxists hate capitalists. This is clear. And they're also not very bright. I hope it's clear from what I've said before. And we'll probably talk about in general, the ethics of capitalism in some other video, maybe a month later or about so, but we'll see. So again, to conclude this huge rant about Marxism itself, I would say that, again, the point of Marxism is to incite a conflict, to construct the conflict between proletariat and bourgeoisie, again, by arbitrarily isolating certain parts of a market process and forgetting about everything else. Like, for example, why is this factory working at all? Why does it have profits at all, right? So they only focus on this accountant's statement where you have, you know, this input versus output, etc. So it's a really short-sighted view of the whole process, and it's really just stupid. But anyway, for the purpose of this video, I should again stress that it's all about provoking conflict. Well, yeah, provoking is actually a good word here, to antagonize people, essentially, right? So you have this focal point, if you like, this focus, optically speaking, of conflict between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and you kind of artificially insert additional theories here and there to reinforce that conflict, to make it more bright, if you like. So and Marx actually did quite a great amount of work to that effect. Like, for example, he utilized this labor theory of value that I've already mentioned. He utilized this philosophy of dialectical materialism, which is just a bunch of crap, again, infected by this Hegelian marasmus. Again, it's actually, it bears a lot of similarities with objectivism of Ayn Rand. It's that level of philosophy, if you know what I mean, that low level of philosophy. But anyway, and Marx also utilizes this, you know, formational approach to history, etc., etc., where we have, you know, this primordial communism, then we have slave societies, then we have feudalism, then we have capitalism, and finally we should arrive at communism again. Well, it's so stupid, and there's so many examples of societies that don't fit into that scheme, but who cares? Like, it's the purpose of this theory is only to reinforce the main conflict between proletariat and bourgeoisie. Okay. So yeah, hopefully I made that clear enough already. So let's get back to the topic of Ayn Rand. So why do I say that Ayn Rand is basically a Marxist among libertarians? So again, let's consider this Atlas Shrugged kind of idea, and again, I would claim that this is exactly like the other side of coin of Marxism, if you like. So the idea of Atlas Shrugged is that there exist a productive people, and there exist a bunch of parasites, you know, the leftovers of society, like the gray masses, you know, faceless people, etc., etc. And so what Rand tries to do is to, again, mobilize the resources of these atlases, you know, these chosen few, who kind of grant whatever they produce to these stupid masses, etc., etc. And she kind of proposes to, in a nutshell, she proposes for these atlases to just walk away, you know, since you're the salt of the earth, so to speak, you're the producers of everything, why should you share with these stupid masses who don't appreciate you? You should just go away, etc. So this is essentially what Atlas Shrugging means, right? And again, this is just a tool. The main idea here is to provoke the conflict to gain political leverage, but from these, you know, atlases, the productive ones, etc. So yeah, I think it's already clear enough that this is basically the same idea that Marxism has, but it's only kind of, you know, top-down version of it, sort of, kind of like a standing on the head version, where basically Marxists say that, okay, we should have this proletarian revolution where we'll just kill all the owners of stuff, basically, and rob them, right? We'll take away their stuff. Whereas Ayn Rand says, no, okay, these people want to rob us and kill us, let's just walk away, right? To these bourgeois. But fundamentally, it rests on the same Marxist legs, so to speak, of this conflict, this imaginary, I repeat, conflict between proletariat and bourgeoisie. And it bears the same signs of, you know, ressentiment, this kind of destructive approach to society. So I would claim that both Randianism, or whatever you might call it, this Atlasism, and Marxism, they're both equally antisocial, dystopian, essentially, narratives. And unfortunately, again, much of the negative image of libertarianism is kind of fueled by that Randianism, this absolutely stupid approach to society that Ayn Rand proposes in Atlas Shrugged, that supposedly there exists this, you know, caste of chosen ones who produce all this stuff, and there exists a majority of all the other people who are not even productive in the first place. So yeah, although I would actually say maybe some libertarians actually think so, in which case, well, I'm not on your side, guys. I mean, those guys who think this is a correct narrative, this is a correct perspective. So how should one change that? How could one change that perspective of Randianism? Well, I would say that you should use facts first and foremost. You know, you should use calm discussion, just pure logic and facts, and you can do that. Like, you can show easily what, for example, the Austrian economic school does. You know, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Murray Rothbard, and many other brilliant thinkers. So you can easily show that free market relationships actually benefit everyone, like literally everyone, all the participants of this process that I've described previously. Because market is basically the most effective way of distributing resources, right? I wouldn't be able to describe that in more details right here. Why is it the most effective way? But anyway, so the free market basically makes the resources abundant and cheap, right? From which everyone benefits. And you can even see very strange, to Marxist narrative at least, consequences of that, where if you look at World Bank data, for example, you would see that they, and also the Index of Economic Freedom, for example, from Cato Institute. So if you compare those two, you would see that the Gini index, you know, the index of inequality essentially, anti-correlates with the level of economic freedom, again as determined by Cato Institute. It's the anti-correlation is kind of weak, but it's noticeable, it's there, right? Which means that the freer your economy is, the more free market it is, the less inequality there is, which again is completely incoherent with Marxist narrative, which means it's complete rubbish, which I hope was already clear to you at that moment. So free market benefits everyone, as I've said. And again, you can look at the data if you don't believe me, or you can look at the theories, which also just clearly, logically state how exactly that works and why should it work, and why, if you suppress free market, you get a bunch of horrible effects from that. So yeah, I think in order to suppress this stupid Randianism, stupid quasi-Marxist approach to market economy, you should basically show that the path to wealth doesn't come from neither robbery, as Marxists propose, nor, you know, escapism and walking away, as Randians propose. So both of these are, again, antisocial, dystopian proposals, in my opinion. But you should just calmly show that the free market benefits everyone, literally. Like, I'm not talking about, you know, the crony capitalism that we have today, or the basically half socialism, like the socialism of European Union, the socialism of the United States, etc., where basically they have to make loans of $1 trillion each year only to sustain their level of government expenses, etc. So this is not capitalism, this is not free market. I'm sorry. So yeah, basically free market allows people to benefit each other in the most effective way, and that's all it is, essentially. And as follows from that, all the people might be productive. There is no, you know, chosen caste of some half gods, some atlases that produce whatever the stuff that everyone else consumes. No, it doesn't work that way. Like in a free market, everyone benefits from each other, essentially. They have voluntary deals, voluntary transactions, etc., etc. So, all right, I think that this is enough for today. So, to conclude what I've been talking about, basically, I've tried to convey the idea that Ayn Rand is a Marxist among libertarians, in the sense that she utilizes the very same approach that Marxism utilizes in general. Like Marxism constructs this imaginary conflict between proletariat and bourgeoisie by arbitrarily isolating certain elements of a market process and kind of trying to show through various metaphysical constructs, again completely arbitrary and stupid, that there is a conflict, right? And by ignoring all the other parts of market process. So Marxism creates and reinforces this conflict, and Ayn Rand basically creates the mirror image of that very same conflict, but she kind of flips it over and says that, you know, it's actually the bourgeoisie or whatever is the productive class, and proletariat is just a bunch of parasites. That's what she does, essentially. And it's absolutely counterproductive for both just the libertarian narrative and the whole society in general, because the society would be harmed without a decent dose of libertarianism. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And Ayn Rand prevents the libertarian narrative to be spread out as wide as possible. And I hope I've been able to show it to you in more or less detailed manner. So thank you for watching. The eons are closing.